Joining us now is Dean of Global Futures at Curtin University, Professor Joe Siracusa. Joe Siracusa, thank you for joining us. Let's start with Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio are in Saudi Arabia for peace talks. Now, Marco Rubio told reporters that the minerals deal is not the main topic on the agenda for the meeting. So what's your assessment? What exactly can we expect?
Oh, good morning. Well, look, the meeting is all about preparing the endgame for the Ukraine war. I mean, the Trump administration is determined to bring Zelensky to the table. They've already put enormous pressure on this fellow by cutting off his arms and then temporarily pausing his intelligence, without which you really can't work very well on the battlefield. And intelligence is now coming back in a big hurry. I don't even think President Trump is particularly interested in the minerals deal as first thing. What he wants to do is get Zelensky to agree to a ceasefire. Now, after the ceasefire, then Zelensky has to commit, like President Putin, to a diplomatic solution. So Trump doesn't care how long the negotiations go on, but in the first instance, he wants a ceasefire. I mean, that's what he's determined to do, and that stops the killing, fulfills all of his campaign promises, and then he's able to concentrate on other things. And as you know, this morning, President Trump has a lot of other things to concentrate on.
It's easier said than done. What's your assessment of how this has played out so far? It's incredibly difficult getting Zelensky on board, and then he's also got to deal with Putin. There are indications that Putin wants an end to the war, but we don't know that for sure.
Well, I saw this movie before in the 1960s and the early 70s when the United States was determined to leave South Vietnam and force the South Vietnamese to accept the North Vietnamese offer, or the term offers, after extensive negotiations in Paris. And whether the South Vietnamese wanted to participate or not, no, it didn't make any difference. The United States was going home. And so this is what it's all about. It's about getting the ceasefire on a piece of paper for the president to be able to say he stopped the killing there, and that would be a very good day's work. He said yesterday, interestingly, that he thought the most important problem in the world today is controlling the nuclear arms race. Well, you know, he gets high marks for that because it is very, very important. At the end of the day, the United States and the former Soviet Union, Russia, have most of the nuclear weapons in the world, and one bad exchange of these weapons could be the end of this planet. So, you know, in that sense, the president probably has his priorities right. But look, it isn't going to be that hard. Zelensky's out of cards. You know, he's out of options. He's got a bad option and a worse option. You know,
that's true. Do you think he's realized that now?
Oh, I think he's realized that for the last 6 months. I mean, he must have been sleepless when he saw that President Trump was on the verge of winning that election. I mean, because it was all going to change as soon as Biden left. I mean, yeah. Biden wanted to kick this problem into the weeds until after the election because he didn't want to talk about who lost the war in Ukraine, which is, of course, is an American pastime about who lost this war and who lost that war. It becomes political. But look, Zelensky has no options left. I mean, I think he'll agree to a ceasefire, and not too far along now. I think he will probably step down and make room for other people. I mean, there are people behind him who want to lead. Right. And what I think is sad is I think he could have got most of these terms 3.5 years ago. Well, nearly 3.5 years ago, and you know, and he's going to have to take what he gets now. And look, these wars do not have happy endings. There are no neat conclusions to a war. I mean, all the civil wars in the world leave a lot of loose ends out there, as you know, we'll probably get around to Syria. And these things are not happy, and it makes very, very unpleasant television because we can see what's going on behind the scenes. But Zelensky only has one thing to do, and that is how to figure out how to agree with the Americans, save his reputation a little bit. And, you know, he's had 3 years in the chair in this war, and I'll tell you what, he's lived, you know, 3 lifetimes. I mean, it's been enormous pressure. He flies all over the world trying to get arms and this thing and the other thing, and it's very sad. Ukraine has lost probably a quarter of its people, have gone overseas. They're taking refuge in nearby countries. A lot of the young men have been killed. I mean, these wars, and you know, I know people talked about the old World War II battle wasn't here anymore. Well, it was the return of artillery, destruction of these cities. And of course, you lose commerce, finance, people lost their education, they lost health services. I mean, nations go backwards for a long time after a war.
Let's talk about what's unfolding in Syria following reports of a wave of killings in Syria's coastal region, and it has become the most serious crisis yet for the war-torn country's new government. Now, Syria's new government has signed a deal to integrate Kurdish forces. What's your assessment of the crisis that's unfolding?
Well, it's unfinished business. After the civil war, people tend to get even, particularly if one of the factions becomes the government. I mean, the government of the day in Syria is just a killer regime. They were able to put a mantle of respectability on them at the end of it. They said that there'd be no reprisals, but of course there will be. I mean, there are the Alawites, of course, rallied around Bashir and all those people there, and they did terrible things. And now, of course, Bashir is living in Moscow. He doesn't worry about these kinds of things. And I think people are settling scores. And this will take a couple years. I mean, it's kind of ugly, and it's not very pleasant to watch. But I think
is it going to get worse?
It just might get worse. You know, Syria, outside of the major city there, I mean, most of the place was sort of leveled or in terrible shape, and people have just been kind of eking in existence until there was some form of government. But this is why a ceasefire has to have peace negotiators. When we had a conclusion in Syria, there were no blue helmets from the UN walking in there and separating the lines. Now, what we got is one of the victors came in and started settling scores. I mean, this is as natural as night following day, people settling scores. I mean, if you look at any war history, people come back and they have some things they want to say to people who treated them very badly. I mean, this is the way of the flesh, and we're going to have to watch this for a while. But I think Syria, like Lebanon, and maybe even Gaza one day, will bounce back to life. But it's going to take many, many years.
Let's speak about Israel, the Middle East. So Israel believes that there are 24 hostages, all men, who are alive in Gaza, along with 35 dead captives. Now, there are increasing fears for the remaining hostages, as Donald Trump's hostage envoy, Steve Witkoff, confirmed a date had been set for fighting to resume between Hamas and Israel's military, and warned of a joint US-Israeli operation if the hostages are not freed. Now, talks to prolong the ceasefire are expected to resume in Qatar. We know that Hamas wants to start negotiations on the ceasefire's second phase, which would see the release of the remaining hostages from Gaza and the withdrawal of Israeli forces and a permanent end to the war. Obviously, we need all of those hostages back. I have so much fear knowing that there are 24 left to remain alive and we need to get them back. What's your reading of the situation at the moment? Will a ceasefire be extended?
Well, I think it will be, at least as deference to President Trump. President Trump has a lot to say what goes on in the pursuit of the war in Israel, though Netanyahu can probably do his own thing. If Joe Biden gave Netanyahu a blank check to do what he wanted, do you imagine what Donald Trump has given Netanyahu? He's already told Hamas that terrible things are going to happen to them if they don't release these hostages. But keep in mind, Gabriella, in parts of the world, other people, other nations are not as sentimental about hostages or prisoners. Americans are, Israelis are. I mean, Australia would be too, as a matter of fact. I know it was the end of Jimmy Carter's administration when he got very sentimental about the hostages in Tehran. And so the hostages is just the beginning of the deal. You know, as far as I'm concerned, Israel is committed to eradicating Hamas. And when you see a hostage release, who's releasing them? Hamas is directing traffic, delivering the mail, and all the rest of it. There's nothing to replace them yet. So we don't even know what's going to happen the day after. I mean, I think Netanyahu is playing a very loose game in that part of the world, and even thinking more about the West Bank. But I think the hostage problem is just the tip of the iceberg of the problems that remain. Gaza is a mess. West Bank's a mess. Israel doesn't really know what to do going forward if it has to deal with Hamas in the future. And the Americans have made it very clear that they want Hamas gone. The only trouble is Hamas is not gone. The PLO, as Palestinians have not taken their place. So, it's the old story I heard in the second Iraq War. I mean, we can't find anybody to deal with. So you tend to go down back alleys and on Arab Street looking for someone who will speak for somebody else. And it's very, very hard to conclude any kind of operation there.
Finally, I want to get your thoughts on Mark Carney, who's going to replace Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He did not hold back blasting Donald Trump over the trade war between the US and Canada. What's your reading on him?
Well, look, Gabriella, 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the American border. They are honorary American citizens. That is, they follow each other's sports and they drive across the line to go to work in each other's countries. This idea of these warlike cries coming out of Canada and America is just ridiculous. And Carney has taken the bait here. He's a technocrat. He's not a real politician. I mean, I think Canadians are sick of real politicians. And he looks like he can deal with with Trump. He's a governor of the former Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, too, as a matter of fact. And he looks like he can handle himself. And I listened to his speech, and the speech was, well, if it was not anti-American, it had an anti-American ring to it. He says, we're not going to be beaten up by Donald Trump. But you watch the real player, what happens. Canada's like Australia. The premiers there have a lot of clout. And Doug Ford, the premier of Ontario, is raising the price of electricity to 3 American states by 25%. This is off the Canadian grid. And he said he's going to cut the electricity off altogether unless Trump backs down. So Carney not only has to deal with Donald Trump, he's got to deal with his own premiers who are on the warpath, too. So he's got a difficult job ahead. And I think he'll be fairly successful because, as you know today from the stock market, the American fundamentals do not like what's going on in Canada. The 3 car makers don't like what's going on. And sooner or later, Donald Trump is going to have to, let's say, have a reality check here, and he's going to have to back down.
Dean of Global Futures at Curtin University, Professor Joe Siracusa, really appreciate your insight and analysis. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.